Okay, this is Bruce from Animated Prop Systems, and I'm going to be demonstrating the PWM motor control board with record feature. Got the board here. We've got a standard wiper motor from monsterguts.com, and then I'm using a 12 volt 6 amp power supply. So let's take a look at the board here. I've got power input coming in either through a standard 2.1 millimeter jack or screw terminals. Got our on switch here with the green LED. We've got the screw terminals going out to the motor. We've got the potentiometer that's used to control the speed and direction of the motor. And then for our record function, I've got the record button and a playback button. And then I also have a record lockout switch that can be used to prevent inadvertent recording. And then on the side here we've got screw terminals for 12 volts and 5 volts out and ground to connect to your motion sensor or pressure mat. And then we've got both a high and a low input trigger. Okay, let's look at the board in operation now. I'm going to use the potentiometer to control the speed and the direction of the motor. So if I rotate it to the right, the motor goes one direction, and the farther I turn the potentiometer, the faster the motor goes. If I bring it back so the slot in the potentiometer is straight up and down, the motor's stopped. And if I continue rotating it the other way, the motor turns the other direction and increases speed. So I'll bring it back to stop position here. Now the record function is very easy to use. I'm just going to push the record button and I'll record a little sequence here. Bring it back to the stop position. Press the record button again to stop the recording, and it's now saved that sequence, and I can play it back using the play button or when it gets one of the trigger inputs. And even if you power down the board, it'll remember that sequence. So I'll go ahead and push the play button, and it'll play back that sequence I just recorded. And when it's done, the LED will go off to indicate that the sequence is done. Now, the record lockout switch over here actually does two different things. If I move it to the lock position, the first thing that you'll notice is that the record button no longer works. So it helps you prevent against inadvertently pressing the record button. But I also want to show another feature that it has. I'm going to get the motor going in a slow clockwise position. And when I move the record lockout switch from the unlock to the lock position, it's actually captured the speed and direction that the motor is going at right now. So in between triggers, or in between pressing of the play button, it'll always go at this speed and direction. And then when it gets a trigger, or you press the play button, it'll go back and play the sequence that we recorded. And then when it's done with the sequence, it'll go back to that slow clockwise movement that we recorded. So if you want the motor to stop in between your triggers, you need to adjust the motor to a stop position with the switch in the unlock position, and then move it back to the lock position. So now we'll press play. It'll play the recorded sequence, and when it's done, it'll stop because the motor was stopped when we moved the switch from the unlock to the lock position. Alright, let's take a look at the trigger inputs for a second. I mentioned before that it's got 12 volts out, 5 volts out, and ground, and those can be used to power a motion sensor or to go through something like a pressure mat or a simple switch. In this case, I've connected a simple momentary push button switch between the ground and the trigger and low buttons. And I'll just go ahead and push that, and you can see when I push the button, the LED for the trigger and low button goes on. There's also another LED for trigger and high. And when it detects that trigger, it plays the sequence. And I'll also show that when the sequence is playing, even additional presses of the trigger will not cause the sequence to restart. It'll always play the full sequence and wait until it's finished before it accepts another trigger. So that's an overview of the PWM motor control board with record feature, and it's available from Animated Prop Systems at pimpmyprop.com.